Well, good afternoon, everybody.
Is this okay?
I think we should get started.
Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, I have
Oh my
an
God.
announcement from Larissa. She asked me to switch, all of you to switch your phones off or to put them on silent mode. And she will remind you at the end to switch your phones back on. Anyway, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Jean Kupferschmid. And Jean has been here for just over a year. And I'd just like to give you some background to Jean. Jean actually was born in Dresden in Germany. Her mother was originally from Russia, and she was a naturalized American, and she was in Germany visiting family when the Great Depression took place. And she stayed in Germany because she had no job to go back to in America, as everybody was unemployed. And she met her husband in Germany, who was originally from Poland. And Jean was born, and a year and a half later, her mother decided they better go back to the States because she was a naturalized American and only had to be back within 5 years, or else she would lose her green card. So anyway, that brought Jean back to America, and she grew up in Chicago and lived in various cities in the United States. She went to City College and to Boston University, and then joined the faculty at Boston College, where she was on the faculty for 29 years. And her expertise was in Spanish and in Latin American studies and literature. She's written 14 textbooks. I'm sure I've missed a lot out, but she's going to tell us today about the Jewish, the history of the Jews in Latin America. And we really look forward to your talk, Jean.
Thank you. Thank you. Slight correction. I taught at Boston College. I got my advanced degree at Boston University. Okay. Thank you very much, Mike. Has anyone here ever lived in Latin America? Yeah, where? La Plata, Argentina. Okay. For how long?
3 months.
3 months. That was probably enough. Anyone else? Has anyone here traveled to Latin America? Ah, plenty. Okay. So you'll have some idea of perhaps of what I'm talking about. And I'm also going to recommend some books on the subject that you might want to read. Well, why don't I start off? Oh, no one has pencil and paper. And I don't have anything to put it up. Well, I'll pass it around afterwards. And then you can take them, because some of these books are very interesting. Particularly because of the authors. There's a new one out right now, as a matter of fact, by Ilan Stavans, who teaches at Amherst College, and it's called Seventh Heaven, and it's about Latin America. And the other books, I found it very interesting to note that one's written about Colombia, one about Argentina, one about Peru, one about Brazil, and one about Bolivia. So it's a nice assortment, and if you're interested, you can look at that. Okay, how did the Latin American Jewish community come into being? Well, we all know that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and all of that he had a Jewish navigator, perhaps, who will really ever know. But the majority of the Jewish population of Latin America came there either with World War I, getting away from Europe, or, well, of course, there was the Inquisition earlier, but those were small numbers. And certainly a much larger number came with World War II, either before, those who were lucky enough to get out, and because it was hard to get into some of these countries, and some came as refugees after the war. And the first group of Jews came at the end of the 19th century, and they were escaping pogroms and anti-Semitism. And after World War II, they were refugees who perhaps had family there, or else people came to Latin America seeking greater opportunity. Certainly the ones who came at the end of the 19th century were seeking greater opportunity, and those were called, there is a book about them, called The Jewish Gauchos of the Pampas. The gaucho was the cowboy of Argentina, and the Jews came, and Baron de Hirsch, an Austrian nobleman, Jewish, bought a large quantity of land in northern Argentina in the province of Santa Fe, with the idea of creating a Jewish colony there to help his co-religionists escape from Europe. So they came. They were called the Jewish Gauchos of the Pampas, and there's a book about them by a writer by the name of Alberto Gerchunov. And they created a town which they named Moises Ville, which is Mosesville. Moises is Moses in Spanish. And in the province of Santa Fe, they started off with absolutely nothing except the land, and they worked very hard. There is a film about it, but I don't know where you get it. I've seen it only once. And they started from scratch with nothing, a small group of Jews from the Ukraine. And they built it into a thriving community. However, the big city has its allure. And by the second generation, the numbers working the farm began to dwindle. By the third generation, Moises Ville was no longer a Jewish colony. They drifted away to the big city and its allures. I think we might even have that book here. I know you can get it. Where you can get some of these books, oddly enough, is at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, and you can go online and find it, and some of the books I mentioned will be there in English. I know that's important also. Well, the land was bought by Moritz Hochschild, who was an Austrian and very wealthy. He developed mines in Bolivia. He was one of the 3 tin barons who developed the tin mines in Bolivia, and he had a great deal of money. So he saved thousands of Jews that way, together with the Joint Distribution Committee. And later on, they developed the same process to get agricultural visas in World War II, at the beginning of World War II. And in fact, he was called the Bolivian Schindler, if you remember Schindler's List, that film. Well, the Jewish communities, I'm sorry to say, the Jewish communities of Latin America are shrinking. And the reasons for this, number one, smaller family size. People no longer have between 5 and 10 children. That's one reason. Another one is a higher level of assimilation and intermarriage. Another reason they're shrinking is the economic and political instability of those countries, which causes people to want to leave. Many go, those who can, come to the US, and others go to Israel, where there are several Latin American kibbutzim. And so those are the destinations. Certainly a lot of the doctors want to come here. The Jewish communities of Latin America go back very far. As you know, they started to sail, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, he had Jews. And for example, the Jewish community in Ecuador dates back to the 16th and 17th centuries. On the other hand, it's also one of the smallest communities with a population of only about 290 people. And the other well, the largest Jewish community, of course, is in Argentina. The second largest is Brazil. And the third largest is Chile. So as you can see, those are the countries that form what is called the Southern Cone: Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Well, Brazil isn't quite the cone, but the cone is down below. And also there are quite a few in Uruguay, which is that small blue country tucked in there. But certainly Argentina had a large Jewish population. People leave those countries probably for economic reasons as much as anything else, or to get a professional education, doctors, for example. So some of these communities are really quite small. Like in Ecuador, there are only about 200 Jews and 290, and they're predominantly German. And in a country like El Salvador, 100 to 200 to 300. I've been there, and they do have a Jewish day school and things like that, but it is a dwindling community with a great deal of intermarriage of necessity. And many Jews did come to Latin America. Those who could get out of Europe just before World War II came to Latin America as a refuge from the Nazis. However, the Latin American governments only permitted about 84,000 refugees between 1933 and 1945, which was half the number that had been previously admitted. So they weren't very keen on having a lot of Jews come into their countries either. However, the largest community is Argentina. At one point, there were 500,000 Jews in Latin America. However, today in Argentina, there are 180 to 250,000, which is down from over 300,000 in the early 60s, even though it's the largest Jewish community in Latin America. Quite a few of the young Argentines go to Israel. They make Aliyah. And in Israel, there's a couple of kibbutzim that are almost exclusively Latin American. I went down to see someone off going to Israel, a young man, and we were a crowd. It was boat. He was going by boat. And down on the dock, we were quite a crowd, and people began to sing, and he was off. And some of them have even been killed in Israel's wars. And also in Latin America, there is a large Sephardic community as well as an Ashkenazi one. And that's quite prominent also. But in fact, speaking of emigration or immigration to Israel, the immigration to Israel from Argentina and Mexico recently increased by 55%, and from Brazil by 72%. Now, why are these people intent on emigrating from the countries where they were born? It's political unrest, economic unrest, and certainly the Jewish community is set up in such a way that they have spent a lot of their lives involved with it, and maybe Israel offers them a better future in view of the turbulent times that they're living through right now, economically and politically. If you read the newspaper, lately I haven't noticed much in the paper about Latin America, but what I do read doesn't look very good. Well, it's interesting to note that the early immigrants to Argentina were agricultural workers. They came to set up collective farms. There was an Austrian, Baron de Hirsch, who bought up vast quantities of land in the province of Santa Fe, which, I don't have it on the map, do I? Look towards the north in Argentina, and Santa Fe will be there. And he bought land to set up an agricultural settlement, and it was named after him, Moisés Vige. Moisés is Moses in Spanish, and they named it after him. And people came. It was a thriving community. There's even a film about them, but I haven't seen it. I couldn't get it. I have seen it. And they worked the land, and it was a thriving town. But what happened? By the second generation, the young people started to drift away. Some went to the big city to go to the university to get an education. Others simply drifted towards bigger communities, and by the third generation, Moisés Vige hardly existed anymore. It is no longer a Jewish colony. And interestingly enough, the layout of the town was like a shtetl. And right now, the Argentines are trying to get it declared a UNESCO historic site. Now, then we get to the 1930s. In Argentina, there were Nazi rallies in the 30s. As you will recall, Adolf Eichmann was found in a suburb of Buenos Aires. Klaus Barbie was found in Bolivia. And Eichmann, of course, was sent to Israel, but he lived quite comfortably and happily in Buenos Aires. And after the war, 180 Nazis entered Argentina so that they would not be picked up by the Americans and the British. I recall going to a summer resort in Uruguay. If you can see, it's that little blue country there, but it's a very popular beach area for Argentines to spend the summer. And we went there, and in one hotel, everyone spoke German. We left, moved to another hotel. Oh, I should add that the reason we were going there is that I lived in Argentina for 3 years. Now, also, with that large German population in Argentina, they had their own colonies, farm colonies. They also had their own school in Buenos Aires, the Colegio Alemán, but that's okay. The Americans had their own school too, and the British did also. So the Germans as well. And they also had their own hospital in Buenos Aires, the Hospital Alemán. So they were quite a powerful community in Argentina. And I am talking now of the 50s, 60s, and 70s of 19. So this is really quite recent. And perhaps some of you recall that in Argentina in 1992, the Israeli embassy was bombed and 22 died. Then in 1994, the AMIA was bombed. The AMIA was the Jewish Cultural Center. All the Jewish organizations in Buenos Aires had their offices there, and a lot of activities took place there. They had a little photo gallery there that was very interesting, showing how the community had developed. And the AMIA was bombed in 1994. 85 people were killed and 200 were wounded. Now, who bombed? That is a good question. Because it was Argentina, the culprits were never found. There is a strong German population and community in Argentina. So that it's still an open question. I don't know if any of you recall a film that was out. It was nominated for the Oscar quite a while ago. It was called The Official Story. Okay, that was a long time ago, and it didn't get the Oscar as a foreign film, but it was about the rule in Argentina of the generals, the dirty war, as they called it, which was not very favorable to the Jews either. They picked up a lot of young Jews, and of course there was torture, jail, and all of that. So Latin America was also a good hideout for the Nazis. Remember, where did they find Adolf Eichmann? In a suburb of Buenos Aires. Where did they find Klaus Barbie? In Bolivia. And they were living happily and comfortably, and no one bothered them. Now, the history of the Jews in Latin America goes back even further than the colonies in Argentina. It goes back to the Inquisition and then the 18th century, when the Jews began to come to Latin America. And in Brazil, which had been very open to immigration, however, they closed immigration to Jews in 1933, from 1933 to 1945. Brazil is the 10th largest, Brazil, the whole country, and that includes Rio and Sao Paulo and the other big cities, has the 10th largest Jewish community in the world. It's Ashkenazi and Sephardi, and anti-Semitism there is considered a violation of the law. So I guess it's estimated that 60% of the Jewish community in Brazil is intermarried, and not all of them are Ashkenazi. It's a large Ashkenazi and Sephardic community. In fact, they figure that about 20% of the Jews in Brazil are of Moroccan origin. Then there's the interesting story of the Dominican Republic. It's not even on that map, it's so small. It's an island. It's the other half of Haiti. The island, Haiti's on one side, Dominican Republic on the other. And Trujillo, at that time, the awful dictator that we've heard about, nonetheless, he welcomed the Jews to come to the Dominican Republic. Why? Because they were an underdeveloped place and he wanted their skills. So he opened the doors of the Dominican Republic to the Jews in the 1930s, and on an abandoned banana plantation, they set up a Jewish community called Sosua in the 1930s. I actually met someone who had lived there then, and when I met her, she was living in Keene, New Hampshire. So I guess from one small place to the other. But certainly no harm came to them, and as this woman testified, they lived well and happily. During World War II, the Brazilian ambassador to France gave out visas to go to Brazil. And for that, he is among the Yad Vashem, includes him as one of the righteous among the nations. Today, it's hard to get a fix on the size of the Jewish communities. On the net, you get all sorts of figures, but the point is that they are dwindling. It's intermarriage, as I mentioned before, and people are leaving. For example, young people want to come to the States to study, and once they come here, you can't get them to go back. So the communities are getting much smaller. And to give you an idea, in Argentina, they figure it depends on what you read. The numbers go anywhere from 180,000 to 260,000. That's not a very good way of figuring. In Brazil, 150,000. Mexico, 50,000. Uruguay, 24,000. And Chile, 24,000. Panama has a large Sephardic population, 12,000. And so on. They just get smaller and smaller until you get to Ecuador with 290. However, believe it or not, Panama has had 2 Jewish presidents by the name of Del Valle. Since then, there's anti-immigration legislation and immigrant quotas, both in here in the United States, in Argentina, Canada, and also South Africa, so that limits Jewish immigration. In Mexico, you have a large Sephardic population, which is primarily Syrian, and they came over in the 1920s and the 1930s. In Brazil, things are changing because if you read the newspaper, there are now, the economy is always a big issue in Latin America because those are countries that depend heavily on exports. So there is a large emigration, people coming here because of the changing economy, and also in places like Colombia where they kidnap people, industrialists or businessmen, so it's hardly the place to be. On the other hand, in Brazil, which is still friendly to Jews, very much so, in the city of Sao Paulo, there is the Albert Einstein Israelite Hospital, their own Jewish hospital, and in Buenos Aires, Argentina, there is the Jewish hospital. And the smallest populations, when we get down to Central America, we're talking about populations of 100 to 300 people. So that's not a very big community, although I have been to Honduras with a Jewish organization, And I must say that the community really turned out for us. They had a small synagogue, and they were extremely welcoming. Now, any questions? Yeah.
What about Mexico?
Oh, Mexico has quite a good-sized Jewish community. And in fact, some of them send their kids to college here in this country. And it's a very safe Jewish community.
My grandson has a
Pardon me?
girlfriend whose family. My grandson has a girlfriend whose family are originally from Mexico.
Oh, yeah. It's,
She has lots of
yes, I've spent a lot of time there. And it's a very welcoming community. Any other questions? Venezuela. Oh, times are pretty bad there. The Jewish community, I have the figures here somehow. It's gone down from about the numbers were something like 24,000 down to 7,000. Because times, of course, are very bad there. And as I said, it depends upon the government. They swing from left to right, and either extreme is not good for the Jews, that's usually what happens.
How about the Brazilian forest, which is being
I can't hear.
sorry. How about the Brazilian forest, which is being chopped down by farmers for farming, and in so doing, they're affecting the breathing, or they're affecting the environment very radically, because if that forest goes down, we will have less oxygen to breathe.
I'm afraid I don't
When
understand.
a forest gives oxygen for the human beings to breathe, it's a problem in Brazil. I have a friend in Brazil, and he's very worried about it. So it's against the law to cut down the forest. It's happening anyhow.
Right. I don't see what that has to do with the Jewish communities
Not,
of
but
Latin
the Jewish
America.
community is in Brazil, as you mentioned. There is a Jewish community there.
Yes, but
everywhere.
they're not exactly chopping down the Amazon.
I'm not saying they are. They're being affected by those who are chopping down the trees.
Yeah.
Coming. Give me 1 second. I'm young, but
Well,
I'm
there's a
still-
question here, this gentleman.
I'll bring you right back. Hold on. You didn't mention Cuba.
Cuba. Oh, that's a good question. The Jewish community is dwindling. I was there about 15 years ago. We went to the Jewish Community Center. There are fewer left. It's a much smaller, older population. They were mainly Jews who had come from Europe, who had gotten refuge in Cuba during World War II. And most of them now are in Miami. You hear a lot of Spanish spoken in Miami, even in the temple.
I was going to ask a comment about Buenos Aires, but on the subject of Cuba, we were there a few years ago, and I believe the population at that time was about 1,200 Jews for the entire country.
Oh, no, 1,200. No, I would say it's more, even now, with the diminished population, it's like 180,000.
In Cuba?
Oh, Cuba, I thought you said Buenos Aires.
No, I switched topics,
Oh,
sorry.
Cuba, it's greatly diminished.
Yeah, about
yes.
1,200
But I
when we
did
were
go
there.
to the synagogue in Cuba, and it was,
Yeah.
of course, hardly anyone was there except us, my little group. Yeah.
An anecdotal story about Cuba for a second. We were in a synagogue there, and they had several Torah scrolls, and it turns out that one of them was donated by a temple in Swampscott, Massachusetts, and sitting in the congregation was a gentleman from Swampscott, Massachusetts.
Ah,
Yeah,
Well-
But what I had intended to inquire about was back in Buenos Aires and the bombings. It was my understanding that they had evidence that Iran was behind all that.
Yes, they suspected Iran. There was a big investigation. It never went very far. And one of the investigators was a young lawyer named Alberto Nisman, and then he was killed. And it never went very far. I remember in my last visit to Buenos Aires going picketing in front of the Iranian embassy together with a lot of other people. It did no good. We'll never know. There is a large Arab population in parts of Argentina and Paraguay and in Brazil, and we will never know. The last time I was down there, I was sitting, when the plane stopped in Venezuela, the gentleman who sat in the next seat was an Arab who lived in Venezuela and gave me the full party line, and I was on a plane. I couldn't go anywhere.
Can you talk to us a little bit about anti-Semitism in there? Because my recollection when you talked about the War of the Generals, wasn't that when Jacobo Timmerman was involved and he was disappeared, as they say?
The disappeared. That is quite the story. A lot of the disappeared were political activists, which is not to excuse the fact that they disappeared. It was the generals who were going to, quote unquote, clean up Argentina, get rid of the leftists, and a leftist could have been anyone who was socially active. And they simply picked up people off the streets, and it was a horrible period. The generals were in charge, and one of the things they did was they would pile these people who were accused of being leftists, they would pile them into a plane, fly out over the Atlantic, and push them out the door. It was a very horrible period, and I remember being down in Argentina on a visit at that time and being absolutely terrified a lot of the time, especially when my oldest son came and I was afraid he would say something. To live in fear like that is a terrible thing. And when you don't know if your neighbor's going to be picked up tomorrow. Yes?
Hold on, Charlie. Charlie, wait.
Wait, you're getting a microphone.
The current Pope is from Argentina, and the Jewish community there and in South America looked upon him as a breath of fresh air. What has become of his legacy?
I don't know. Argentines are not rigid Catholics. Church is someplace you might go on Sunday if you have nothing else to do. That's how it was explained to me, and I'm simply repeating what was explained to me. You do not see people walking around wearing a cross or rushing off to church on Sunday morning. They're very relaxed about it.
So, Jane?
Oh. And he had a lab in New York with Barnes Fellow. There was a young man from Chile whose family, he and his wife and 3 children who were born in New York, were there for many years. When Allende was overthrown, he, knowing full well that my husband was Jewish, he announced he was going back to Valparaiso because many Jews were leaving and it would be cheap to buy a house. And he was going back to take advantage of that.
That was one person.
Well, but I think,
He was hardly
Yeah.
representative.
yeah, I hope not.
Yes.
My years might be off, but it's about 20 years, maybe longer, where I know the Argentine Jews were very affected by the a tremendous bank crisis in Argentina.
The
And,
what?
a bank crisis, a crisis of.
Oh, yes, yes.
And there was a small Jewish population of Argentinians in Boston, and I know there was a great deal of outpouring of money and collection for that Jewish population. And then 10 years later, I was actually in Buenos Aires and going to a synagogue there and seeing almost 10 years out of that situation, the people dressed in their finery, but it was shabby, after 10 years. And I'm wondering, did they recover, or what was the consequence of that crisis?
I don't recall the consequence. There's always a bank crisis there, so I don't know which particular one you're referring to. We're not talking about stable governments or democratic institutions. Things change rapidly down there. There's often a bank crisis. The bank crisis is usually the amount of dollars you can get in exchange for pesos. They're all through the cities. There are exchange houses. You've probably seen them in Europe, haven't you? Exchange houses. And people usually collect their salary in pesos and then rush over to the nearest exchange house to get dollars for it, because the only stable currency is the dollar. So they hoard their dollars. That's what it's like to live in an unstable economy.
That's what,
With all of the immigration or the attempted immigration from Latin America to America now, you hear very little, quote, Jewish influence or actually being those who were, all Jews are not, the greatest bankers in the world and make all the money. So, but I've never heard about the influx of Latin Americans coming to America, including Jews.
Okay, number one choice is if you're going to emigrate, it's usually the U.S. and you have to know English to get a job. And certainly doctors take advantage of that. Doctors can always get a job, and the medical training in Argentina and Brazil is very good, so they take advantage. Jews often go to Israel. I have seen them there as I said, there are several kibbutzim that are exclusively Latin American. And I've seen them off at the docks, and, everyone sings for them and all of that. But there is a strong Zionist influence, especially among the less wealthy. The wealthy will always be comfortable, but the ones who are not want to go to Israel. And also, there's an outpouring of young professionals who want to improve, either take courses at American universities or improve their skills. So you will find quite a few doctors in Boston who came from Latin America. And lawyers know, because the legal system is totally different. So a lawyer doesn't stand a chance, but a doctor does. And other professionals also. and non-professionals. Your gardener might have just come from one of those countries too. Everyone wants a better life.
There's a large concentration of Jewish industrialists and wealthy people who have come from Venezuela, in Florida, in Miami. There's a great influx. There's been a great influx.
Oh, yes. Miami is filled with the Latin American Jews. A lot, well, in Venezuela right now, things are very uncomfortable because of the government. And many of the middle class and upper class Venezuelans are leaving Venezuela. The emigration has been enormous. It's an uncomfortable situation there, as sometimes happens in Latin America. It's both political and economic. Remember, a lot of these countries are also dependent upon export of raw materials, whether it be bananas or some rare mineral or something like that. So these countries can fluctuate very greatly economically. I wanted to recommend a couple of books that you might find interesting. I don't know if they have them here. I wish I could have, but one of them is Maria, which is written by the author's last name. I'll pronounce it in English, Isaacs. In Spanish, it would be Isaacs. And he's from Colombia. And a new book just came out, and I've just ordered it. And you should read his books anyhow. The author is Ilan Stavans, Stavans. He's a professor at Amherst College, right here in Massachusetts, but he's a Mexican Jew, and he's written quite a few books. And his last book, which I just sent away for it, but it sounds very good. It's called Seventh Heaven. And a good place to find a lot of books by Latin American authors, this is going to sound very strange, is the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. They have an excellent selection of books by Latin American writers. And one that, well, of course, there's one about the gauchos, the Jewish gauchos in Argentina. And I'm not doing well with this thing at all. Well, is that working?
It's super working.
And one that I'd recommend, and you can get the name easily when I pronounce it, is he's now a Dartmouth professor, but his name is Leo Spitzer, and the name of the book is Hotel Bolivia. And he and his family came to Bolivia as refugees from Germany before the war. So it's a fascinating book. And I have a few others if anyone's interested afterwards.
When you were teaching at Boston College, did you interact with any students from South American countries and discuss with them the Jewish situation there?
Never discussed the Jewish situation. I was the faculty at some point. I became the faculty advisor to the Club Latino, the Latins Club. And I could never quite understand how that happened, but I was their faculty advisor. These were the Latin American students at Boston College, and I will say that most of them came from Puerto Rico. And so it was this weird situation where Kupferschmid was their faculty advisor. But I don't think the question of my being Jewish ever came up. I always took the day off for the high holidays, so there was no question of that.
Jean, did any involvement are you aware of in the drug cartels, the Jewish population?
Of the what?
The
Jewish?
drug cartels in Latin America. Is there any involvement, Jewish involvement in that?
At the moment, I don't see anything in the papers or in the news that I get. There has been a lot of what goes on in Latin America depends upon the economy, which you and I are not used to such an erratic economy, which one day is up and the next day is down. When you get your salary right today in pesos, and instead of going home with your salary, you rush to the bank to change it into dollars, so you'll have some security. We don't live that way, so it's hard for us to understand it, but there is always insecurity there.
So
It's economic, it's political. Not so much political anymore. Remember also that after World War II, a large number of Germans went to Brazil and Argentina. I recall going to a beach resort in Uruguay, and in the hotel, they all spoke German. Of course, we moved out the next morning. And they were not German Jews, I can assure you.
so
It was a very uncomfortable thing for someone with dark hair.
Jean, on that note, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for a most wonderful talk.
Thank you for listening to me.